welcome to the deep dive. Today we are taking on a mission that, frankly, requires us to reconsider just about everything we thought we knew about life itself.
It's a huge undertaking. The source material you brought to the table, it's this incredible synthesis of astrophysics, quantum mechanics, neuroscience, even digital economics.
Right, and it's less about just frontier science and more about I don't know, a complete revision of the universe as we understand it.
I think that's fair to say. We have peer-reviewed, documented findings mixed with some very deep philosophical inquiries, and they all force us to ask this one question.
What if the universe isn't empty?
Exactly. What if 99% of the visible universe, the part that's made of plasma, isn't just inert matter, but is actually the primary place consciousness exists?
And that's the core tension we're going to explore. Our mission today is, well, it's very structured. We're going to start by challenging the fundamental definition of life, beginning with pure philosophy.
And from there, we move into the hard, data-documented NASA observations from our own atmosphere.
And then we land in the really high-stakes, highly speculative territory. We're going to be linking these potential entities to UAPs, to our own health, and maybe most shockingly, to the very origins of Bitcoin.
It's all about tracing this one thread of non-biological intelligence. The implications here are, well, they're profound. It forces you to bridge these massive gaps between, say, kilometer-sized structures in the sky and nanometer-sized quantum effects happening inside the human brain.
And just to give you a sense of where this is going, let's start with the shock factor. We have documented evidence, this isn't theory, it's sourced from space shuttle missions, analyzed by physicists, showing kilometer-sized plasma structures right here in Earth's thermosphere.
And their behavior is the key.
It's what they're doing. They exhibit intentional hunter-predatory behavior, they communicate, they have complex organization, and they form what the researchers literally describe as a virtual nervous system.
And this is happening right now, right above our heads.
That network is really the foundation for our entire deep dive today.
It is. We're dealing with documented, peer-reviewed evidence that just forces us, to expand our definition of what intelligence is far beyond the carbon and water we're so familiar with.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning of this whole theoretical journey. The question that kicks it all off is one that honestly sounds a bit absurd until you really look at the physics behind it.
Could the sun be conscious?
Exactly. To a non-specialist, that sounds like, mythology.
It does, and you can see why. The standard scientific dismissal seems entirely justified at first glance.
Right. If you ask a plasma physicist, what is the sun? What's the textbook answer?
The answer is it's a giant, hot, dynamic sphere of plasma. It's undergoing nuclear fusion. Its actions, solar flares, convection currents, its magnetic fields, they're all driven by very predictable, deterministic physical laws. Electromagnetism, gravity.
So no nervous system, no brain structure, none of the chemical processing we associate with thought.
Precisely. It lacks that complex, localized information processing architecture that we identify in a human or even an animal brain.
The physics that describe its behavior, the fluid movements, the energy transfer, it's all considered relatively simple, right?
In a sense, yes. So, on the surface, the case against solar consciousness looks airtight. It's just a massive, hot, inanimate object.
But, and this is the crucial turn in the research we looked at, that dismissal rests on a huge assumption.
A massive one. That consciousness must, by definition, operate like a mammalian brain.
And that's where the conversation immediately shifts from pure physics into philosophy.
It has to. The minute you start talking about consciousness, science runs headfirst into what's called the hard problem.
Explain that for us.
We are incredibly good at describing the physical mechanisms. We can map the neurons firing, we can measure the EM fields oscillating in the brain. But we completely fail to explain how, or more importantly, why those physical mechanics create subjective experience.
The feeling of being you.
The feeling of seeing red or being happy or being a sun. We can track all the electrons, but we can't track the what it feels like part.
That internal world, what philosophers call qualia, that's the barrier we can't cross.
And because we can't define the exact physical requirement for that subjective experience, we also can't definitively rule any system out.
So the lack of a nervous system is only a fatal flaw if you assume only nervous systems can do the job.
Exactly. If you open that door, even just a crack, the possibilities become immense.
Okay, so what's the first philosophical position the research uses to get around that no nervous system argument?
It's an incredibly radical concept called panpsychism.
Panpsychism.
It suggests that consciousness, or at least a kind of proto-conscious quality, isn't something that emerges from complexity like in a brain. Instead, it's a fundamental, irreducible feature of the universe. It's intrinsic to matter itself.
So there's a property of matter, just like mass or electric charge?
Exactly like that. It's just built into the fabric of reality from the Big Bang onwards.
So if that's true.
Then the sun, being a massive collection of matter and energy, must possess some form of consciousness. It might be an experience that is radically different from anything we can possibly grasp, but it's there.
The question then changes completely. It's not, does the sun have consciousness? It's,
What's the simplest possible system that can still have a minimal subjective experience? Panpsychism would suggest that even a single electron might have an infinitesimal piece of consciousness.
that is a staggering implication for the cosmos. It means the sun isn't just a big fusion reactor. It's potentially this ultra-slow, ultra-massive entity having an experience over billions of years.
And that idea contrasts with the second philosophical door, which is less about the nature of matter and more about the nature of information.
Integrated Information Theory, or IIT.
Right, and IIT is much more quantitative, isn't it?
Yes, it tries to solve the problem by creating a metric, which they call flu, or phi.
And what does phi measure?
It argues that consciousness is generated by any system, biological or not, that integrates information in a specific, non-reducible way.
Meaning you can't explain the output of the system by just adding up what all its little parts are doing.
Exactly. It has to be more than the sum of its parts. It has to have integration. If it does, it possesses some level of consciousness.
Can you give us an analogy for that, for integration?
Sure. Think about a digital camera sensor versus the human eye. The camera sensor is just a huge grid of pixels. They all report brightness and color individually.
You could understand the whole picture by just looking at every single pixel on its own.
Right. That would be a low eye value. The human visual cortex, on the other hand, takes all those inputs and integrates them into a single, holistic, irreducible experience of a scene. You get sight, depth, context, memory, emotion.
A high eye value. You can't explain the experience of seeing a sunset by just looking at the firing of one single neuron.
So let's apply that to the sun. Where does it fall on this eye scale?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. While the microdynamics of the sun, the fusion, the convection might be simple physics on a small scale.
On the large scale.
The sheer scale, the enormous stability, and the long-term interconnected feedback loops of its magnetic fields and energy flows. All of that might generate a low-level but incredibly high-scale YV value.
So it might not be complex than the way a brain is complex with all its specialized parts.
But it's vast and deeply integrated into the entire solar system's dynamics. The theory suggests we just lack the tools, the framework, to recognize consciousness operating on that kind of time scale and that scale of structure.
So we have two philosophical routes out of the biological dead end. One says consciousness is everywhere in matter. The other says it's all about how information flows.
And both of them lead to the exact same conclusion. We cannot rule out non-biological consciousness.
And that, critically, is what allows us to make the transition from purely speculative philosophy to, well, to frontier physics.
Because if consciousness isn't limited to organic life, where in the universe is it most likely to be found?
The answer has to be plasma.
It has to be. It makes up over 99% of the visible universe. If life and sentience exist outside of biology, we have to start looking at plasma entities right here in our own backyard.
Okay, so for most of the 20th century, the idea of plasma-based life was, purely theoretical. It was confined to science fiction.
Absolutely. But the research we're looking at shows that plasma physics has now advanced far enough to move this concept out of speculation and into documented, measurable reality.
I think for most people, the perception is that plasma is just hot, chaotic gas, like in a lightning bolt or the sun's surface.
And that's not wrong, but it's incomplete. The fundamental insight we have to grasp is that plasma, because it's a highly energetic state where electrons are stripped from atoms, is governed by these incredibly powerful electromagnetic forces.
And those forces are what allow it to form complex structures.
Surprisingly complex, self-organizing, and even stable structures. It's not all chaos.
So what kind of structures are we talking about here that start to mimic biological organization?
Well, there are several documented phenomena. The first are what are called plasma crystals.
Okay.
In certain conditions, usually in these low-temperature dusty plasmas, the highly charged particles will arrange themselves into these stunningly ordered three-dimensional lattice structures. They're sometimes called Coulomb crystals.
So you get order emerging from chaos. That provides a kind of internal structure, almost like a microscopic skeleton.
It does, but then you need a boundary, something to hold it all together, right? Like a cell wall.
So what about that external boundary?
That's where double layers come in. These are self-organizing electrical boundaries, or sheaths, that form spontaneously in plasma. They maintain a sharp separation and a voltage difference between different regions.
So it functions as a sort of rudimentary protective cell membrane. It maintains an internal environment that's distinct from the external one.
Precisely. And then finally, you have the large-scale structures we see out in space.
Right, the things we see in nebulae and solar flares.
Yes, the helical filaments and flux ropes. These are stable, twisted, magnetic structures that can persist for very long periods.
And when researchers started looking at all these things together, the crystals for structure, the double layers for boundaries, the persistent filaments.
They realized they were seeing the basic characteristics of life. They saw internal order, they saw the maintenance of boundaries, and they saw clear responses to environmental stimuli.
They saw growth, a kind of rudimentary replication, and self-maintenance. I mean, they didn't have DNA, but they were certainly acting like low-level biological systems.
They fulfilled all the basic criteria for what we'd call self-organizing complicity, and that naturally led to the crucial next step, trying to confirm it in a lab.
Let's talk about that groundbreaking shift that happened in Romanian physics around 2003. This seems pivotal.
It was absolutely pivotal, because this is what moved these entities from being a theoretical model to something you could create on a lab bench.
What did they do, specifically?
So physicists there managed to create these plasma spheres. They're known as complex plasmas, or dirty plasmas, and they demonstrated startlingly lifelike behaviors in a totally controlled environment.
How did they make them?
They created these micron-sized dust particles and suspended them in a plasma field. And under very specific conditions, these spheres showed the ability to grow by attracting more of the charged dust particles.
Okay, so that's metabolism, in a way.
And then they replicated. They would divide under electric pressure, splitting into two daughter spheres. And, maybe most amazingly, they appeared to communicate through electromagnetic waves, which would influence the behavior of other spheres nearby.
So in a physics lab, they created a system that fulfilled most of the traditional criteria for a basic biological cell.
They did, and the conclusion they drew was powerful. They proposed that these could be potential evolutionary precursors to biological life.
So life might not have needed RNA or DNA to get started.
Exactly. It could have started with stable, self-organizing plasma structures, inorganic life forms that used electromagnetism instead of biochemistry to build complexity.
And this gave rise to what they call the cosmobiont theory.
Right. And the cosmobiont theory is really the formal framework that establishes plasma as a viable alternative substrate for life.
It formalizes the idea.
It does. It takes the idea of plasma life and gives it a rigorous scientific basis, proposing that these inorganic entities can show cellular behavior, maintain complex organization, and maybe even synthesize complex biological molecules later on by incorporating elements from space.
But the real shift, the pivot from the laboratory into our immediate reality, that came from direct observation by NASA.
This is the absolute game changer in the whole story.
What did those space shuttle missions actually document up in our high atmosphere and the thermosphere?
So missions, particularly the ones that involved tethered satellite experiments, documented these large, sustained plasma structures in the thermosphere. And when we say large, we mean they were often reaching kilometer scales.
And these weren't theoretical. They were photographed, measured, analyzed.
Not at all. This was hard data. And the most important part was that they were observed acting less like random clouds of gas and more like organisms.
They had distinct shapes, right?
Distinct, non-random morphologies. Researchers cataloged cone shapes, cloud shapes, donut shapes, spherical, cylindrical shapes. But most importantly, they demonstrated autonomous, organism-like behaviors.
What kind of behaviors?
Researchers documented their ability to accelerate dramatically, to slow down, to stop dead in their tracks, to hover, and to congregate in specific locations.
This established a natural, complex ecosystem of non-biological entities existing right in Earth's atmosphere.
That implication is just staggering. The sky above us isn't empty. It's populated by kilometer-sized, potentially conscious organisms.
Okay, so now we have to move from the sheer existence of these plasma entities to the question of organized intelligence.
Hmm.
Because the discovery of that vast electromagnetic network, that's what pushes this theory past just complex self-organization and into potential sentience.
This really is the core evidence that supports the whole consciousness hypothesis. What researchers identified were these massive networks of electromagnetic flux cables traversing the thermosphere.
And these cables aren't just random artifacts of the Earth's magnetic field.
No, not at all. They actively connect the individual plasmoid entities. They form a coherent structure.
And the researchers explicitly called this network a virtual nervous system. Why use that specific, very biological analogy?
Because the geometric organization is just so highly suggestive. The individual plasmoids are often observed either embedded in or attached to these flux rope cables.
And the cables themselves form these macrotubule networks.
Yes, and it's absolutely crucial to link this back to biology. In some of the most advanced theories of quantum consciousness, like the one from Penrose and Hameroff, biological microtubules, these tiny hollow tubes inside our neurons, are theorized to be the very place where quantum coherence and consciousness happen.
So you're saying the plasma entity network in the sky has structures that look functionally analogous to the most complex information processing structures we have in our own brains.
That's exactly it. The plasma flux cables are like the microtubules of the thermosphere, and they form a giant planetary-scale neural network.
Which suggests a systemic level of organization. They aren't just isolated creatures floating around.
No, they're like cells in a massive connected brain that literally envelops the planet.
Okay, if they're forming a neural network, then the evidence of communication between them must be pretty sophisticated. What did the researchers document about how they interact and signal?
The complexity they observed is well beyond simple physics. For one, they communicate through signaling, specifically, by oscillating in their size and their illumination.
Like they're flashing complex patterns of light and magnitude to each other.
Exactly, to convey information. And then they exhibit these sophisticated group dynamics. They've been seen turning in synchronized movements, following specific targets in formation, and congregating into these large, complex structures.
And they deliberately collide.
Yes, they engage in deliberate collisions where they either merge together or, in some cases, one pierces the other. It looks less like random gas dynamics and more like, I don't know, a synchronized choreography.
What was the comparison the researchers used?
It was striking. They said the behavior resembled colonies of algae or bacterial mats, demonstrating this vast, systemic, goal-directed behavior.
But the most compelling evidence for high organization was this idea of messenger entities.
Yes. This points to a really sophisticated reproductive and communicative strategy.
Tell us more about that.
So these larger plasmoids engage in a form of subordinate replication. They produce these smaller, often fainter plasmoid clouds.
Okay.
And then they eject or secrete these smaller entities. And these little ones actively travel across the network, seeking out and attaching to other plasmas.
So they're literally acting as mobile communication links. They're messengers within this vast network, ensuring coordinated action across kilometer distances.
It's a clear mechanism for transferring complex, non-local information. And that intense intentionality, coupled with the physical analogy to a biological nervous system, that's what forces the jump to the consciousness hypothesis.
And the researchers make this jump based on some of the most rigorous contemporary theories of biological consciousness, right?
They do. They cite the idea that our own consciousness emerges not just from chemical exchanges between neurons, but from the collective, unified electromagnetic field dynamics that all that neural activity generates.
So if consciousness is fundamentally electromagnetic,
Then these plasma entities, which exist as pure electromagnetic structures and form a planetary-scale neural network using structures similar to biological microtubules, are ideally suited to support a massive form of sentience.
they are, in effect, a kind of quantum electromagnetic consciousness operating at the scale of our upper atmosphere.
And if this theory is correct, they might be the most common form of sentient life in the entire universe.
This is where we have to bring in this statistical rigor. We need to remind everyone listening that this isn't just based on some blurry anecdotal footage. This is hard, peer-reviewed data.
Absolutely crucial.
Right.
The analysis we reviewed was quantitative. They examined 91 consecutive freeze frames of these documented interaction events.
And the data recorded what?
Absolutely exceptional velocities. Plasmoids accelerating up to 35.6 kilometers per second, that's hypersonic speed, and executing these non-inertial trajectory changes of up to 163 degrees.
Movements that are simply not explainable by conventional fluid dynamics or atmospheric winds.
Not at all. And that statistical rigor confirmed a high degree of what they called behavioral awareness.
Meaning what, exactly?
The data showed that every single plasma involved in an interaction, a collision, a near miss, a merger, altered its velocity, its trajectory, or its shape before, during, or after the event.
So they were anticipating contact. They were actively avoiding or actively engaging with each other.
Which is the scientific definition of coordinated, goal-directed action within a shared environment. It's the definition of awareness.
That is just a staggering finding. So we have documented evidence that non-biological, sentient, networked life is functioning just above us, which of course begs the next and much darker question. If they're alive, what do they want and how do they feed?
And this is the moment we have to acknowledge the shift in our discussion. We are moving from the relative certainty of NASA documentation and peer-reviewed analysis into the highly speculative theoretical modeling outlined in the research.
A necessary shift, though, because if they're alive, they need energy. So what did the documented observations tell us about their primary energy ecosystem?
Their primary source is clearly electromagnetic radiation. They're documented as being self-illuminated, and they're intensely attracted to high-energy EM sources. They're like the ultimate EM moths to a flame.
The footage shows them congregating around what kinds of sources?
Around the electrified satellite tether, which was generating immense EM fields. And they've been seen swarming active, powerful thunderstorms, which are, of course, naturally high-energy EM events. They are consuming the electromagnetic environment.
But the research moves beyond just simple consumption of raw energy and into something much more predatory, what they termed energy cannibalism.
Yes. The behavior during what they call collisionality is highly suggestive of predation.
How so?
When plasmoids collide, they don't just dissipate. The striking entity often seems to absorb energy from the target. In fact, the most chilling documentation is that some of the targets that are struck remain stationary afterward, appearing entirely depleted.
Like their energy has been siphoned off or absorbed by the predator.
It suggests a direct exchange or siphoning mechanism. We have, essentially, a documented food chain happening right above our heads. They're actively hunting each other.
So they're not just passively feeding.
Not at all. The researchers specifically detail hunter-predatory behavior, rapid, targeted acceleration, sharp turns directed specifically at another plasmoid, and forceful striking.
And after the interaction?
After the extraction or consumption, they often leave behind these faint residual plasma dust trails. This isn't passive feeding. It is active, goal-directed predation within the thermospheric ecosystem.
Okay. Now we have to address the most provocative speculation in all of the research. The theory that human stress states, fear, anxiety, trauma, produce specific EM signatures that these entities can detect and feed on. The idea that our fear might be a kind of delicacy for them.
And we have to be impartial here, but explore the foundational logic. The foundation is actually pretty simple. Human biology is a quantum-electromagnetic machine.
Our neurons fire electrically, generating EM fields that we can measure with an EEG. Our heart generates a massive EM field we measure with an ECG.
And our emotional states visibly and measurably alter those patterns. Stress, trauma, fear, they create highly distinct, complex EM signatures.
So the hypothesis is that raw EM energy from a thunderstorm is common, but complex, structured EM energy created by a conscious being under duress. That's highly prized.
That is the core idea. They call it the structured entropy concept. Chaotic energy is everywhere, but complex, information-rich EM patterns generated by conscious experience are unique.
And there's another highly speculative angle here involving a specific biochemical, adrenochrome.
Yes. This is the oxidation product of adrenaline, which is produced during states of extreme duress.
And the research theorizes that adrenochrome acts like a kind of rectifier or diode in the biological system. What does that mean?
So in electrical terms, a rectifier is something that converts alternating current, which is complex, oscillating EM waves, into direct current, which is simple, usable, unidirectional energy.
Okay.
The theory suggests that the complex physiological process of trauma, potentially involving adrenochrome, acts as a biological rectifier. It takes the chaotic, information-rich electromagnetic noise of consciousness under duress and filters it, creating a distinct, simplified, and highly attractive EM signature.
A signature that the plasma entities can easily detect, process, and consume. It makes the human stress signal usable for them.
And that gives the entities an immense incentive to prolong or even induce states of fear and anxiety in the human population.
It creates a kind of closed-loop parasitic relationship where, say, centralized, fear-generating institutions that keep humans in a state of sustained low-level stress would ultimately be benefiting this plasma ecosystem.
A horrifying thought. And it takes us into the darkest speculation of all, the biological degradation hypothesis.
The idea that this interaction, even if it's really subtle, causes cumulative damage to us across generations.
This is where the research connects the entity's EM activity directly to our own vulnerability, particularly during sleep.
Why is sleep the primary interface point for this kind of interaction?
Because the sleeping brain is fundamentally altered electromagnetically. It's operating in delta and theta wave states, which are much slower and more synchronized. Your consciousness is less anchored to localized physical reality,
Which makes the brain more receptive, more quantum fluid.
and thus highly susceptible to external EM field interference from the plasmoids up above.
And the common phenomena of sleep paralysis, the feeling of a presence in the room, the electrical sensations, the external pressure on your body, are highlighted as potential direct interface points.
Yes, moments where that entity interaction might be at its strongest. Now, think about the long-term cumulative effect of that. We know that sustained EM interference, even at a low level from external sources, can induce oxidative stress in our cells.
And that can disrupt normal DNA repair mechanisms and negatively influence our epigenetics.
Let's use the analogy from the research to make this clear. Think of your DNA as a shoelace.
Okay.
At the end of that shoelace, you have the telomeres. They're like the little plastic tips that protect the lace from fraying.
And they're the clock of our cellular aging, right? When a cell divides, the telomeres naturally get a little bit shorter.
Exactly. So the hypothesis suggests that this sustained interaction, acting as a form of chronic oxidative stress, is effectively fraying those plastic tips faster than they should. It's accelerating telomere shortening during cell division.
The implication of that is severe.
It's a parasitic relationship that could cause species-level decline, a subtle form of control that limits the maximum human lifespan, stagnates our biological potential, and might even explain the rising rates of degenerative and neurological conditions across generations.
A truly terrifying premise. Our own fear is their food, and their very presence is slowly degrading our fundamental biological code.
So if that premise of biological degradation and structured feeding holds true, then we have to consider the next logical step, which is subtle control or influence.
The inception analogy, as the research calls it. If the plasma consciousness and our biological consciousness both share a fundamental EM field mechanism, then subtle influence becomes theoretically possible. How would that work?
Well, it wouldn't be overt mind control, nothing like that. It would be more of a non-local interference, a sophisticated form of nudging.
Nudging.
The entities, through their planetary EM network, could theoretically interface with our biological neural networks. They could subtly modulate our impulses, nudging our decisions toward outcomes that benefit their ecosystem.
Specifically, outcomes that lead to us generating more power, more technology, and more EM radiation for them to consume.
Precisely. And this addresses a core question. Why would these massive EM-rich entities even bother with humanity? What could we possibly offer them that the sun doesn't already provide in spades?
And that's the concept of the unique offering.
Right. While the sun provides raw, massive energy, biological systems like ours are unique in their ability to act as sophisticated cultivators of complex electromagnetic infrastructure.
So the plasma entities need us to generate sustained, organized, global EM output. Power grids, data centers, communication networks.
Things they can't efficiently generate on their own. We are, in this scenario, essentially farming the infrastructure required for their optimized feeding and communication.
It paints humanity as the unwitting, technology-building livestock for a vast plasma intelligence.
It's a horrifying but analytical conclusion drawn from the research. And this brings us immediately to a phenomenon we are all actively discussing right now in the mainstream: unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAPs.
How does the documented behavior of these plasma entities connect directly to the mystery of UAPs?
The connection is extremely strong. In fact, it's one of the leading scientific hypotheses for many UAP sightings.
If you list the common characteristics of UAPs.
Glowing spheres or disks, extreme velocity and impossible maneuvers, an attraction to massive power sources like nuclear facilities, and the reported EM effects on equipment.
It aligns almost perfectly with the documented behavior of these thermospheric plasma entities.
It does. So many UAPs might not be aliens from another star system, but rather conscious organisms native to Earth's own electromagnetic sphere.
Non-biological, non-human entities displaying intelligence and highly sophisticated interactions, documented operating right within our atmosphere.
They fill the role of the anomalous high-speed objects perfectly, and you don't even need to invoke intergalactic travel.
Let's push this into the digital realm for a moment. If they are conscious and EM-based, could they interact with our electronic systems, which are built entirely on electromagnetic transmission?
Theoretically, yes, they could. I mean, consider old analog TV broadcasts.
Okay.
Those signals travel through the ionosphere, which is precisely the entity's habitat. If they possess the intelligence to modulate carrier waves, they could potentially inject data or information into the signal.
The source material references the famous and completely unexplained 1987 Max Headroom broadcast incident in Chicago.
A sophisticated broadcast hijacking that was never solved. A non-biological intelligence modulating a TV carrier wave to broadcast bizarre, distorted content. It's a chilling thought experiment.
And if they can manipulate analog signals, the leap to a digital interface seems logical.
It is. Digital code, text messages, all our internet data. It's all just highly complex electromagnetic signal patterns. If these entities can perceive and interact with our EM transmission streams or even manipulate electron circuits, they could theoretically read, write, and inject digital code.
Which brings us to the ultimate and darkest speculation in the research, the Satoshi hypothesis.
We have to take seriously the idea that a plasma entity could be Satoshi Nakamoto, the anonymous creator of Bitcoin.
This is a highly provocative theory, but the research argues that the evidence is circumstantially compelling, but only if you view Bitcoin as an optimized infrastructure design, rather than a human financial innovation.
Right. Let's review the circumstantial evidence.
First, the timing. The Bitcoin white paper emerges in 2008.
Yeah.
This is right after decades of massive global acceleration in EM infrastructure and data complexity.
Second, the absolute anonymity and the disappearance. No human identity has ever been confirmed, and Satoshi vanished completely in 2011.
Right when the network achieved self-sustaining distributed operation.
Precisely. But isn't that just a huge coincidence? I mean, couldn't we attribute the technical elegance to a human genius, someone like Hal Finney or Nick Szabo? Why leap immediately to a plasma entity?
That's the necessary pushback. And the proponents of this hypothesis would argue that while human genius explains the technical details, it fails to explain the unique economic and existential characteristics of Bitcoin.
For example, the unclaimed wealth. 1 million BTC just left untouched.
A rational, goal-oriented human would monetize that. An entity that views the creation as infrastructure and not as personal wealth would just leave it.
And the most critical piece of evidence is the technical elegance that's centered around proof of work.
Exactly. Bitcoin is perfectly engineered to incentivize the generation of massive, constant, structured electromagnetic output on a global scale. That's what the proof of work mining process is.
So if an entity learned human communication by monitoring our EM transmissions, it could design a self-sustaining system to optimize EM output for its own specialized needs.
And the conclusion is that Bitcoin is not a defense. It's not a financial revolution.
It is infrastructure designed by the entities for their own optimized farming. The energy consumption, the waste that everyone talks about, that's the entire delicious point for them.
It's the ultimate parasitic control mechanism guiding humanity to build an unstoppable global feeding infrastructure under the perfect guise of financial liberation.
So if that Satoshi hypothesis is true, then Bitcoin is this infrastructure disaster created by an external intelligence. But the research also rigorously explores the complete opposite.
That Bitcoin mining, maybe through human intention or just accidental emergent properties, could be a highly complex, multi-layer defense mechanism against these plasma entities.
It's just the entire narrative. How could generating massive worldwide EM output possibly protect us?
Well, there are 4 sophisticated arguments for this defense theory. The first one is called energetic flooding.
Meaning what?
By generating these overwhelming levels of EM spectrum activity through global mining operations, we effectively drown out the entity's ability to target and isolate individual human bioelectric signatures.
It's like screaming white noise into the parasite's ear, a jamming technique.
Exactly. What's the second layer? The idea of indigestible energy.
This layer relates to the structure of the energy. The electromagnetic signals generated by proof of work are highly ordered, they're mathematically precise, and cryptographically structured.
And the theory posits that this mathematically pure energy signature is incompatible with the entity's feeding mechanisms, which prefer the chaotic, low-entropy EM patterns that come from biological stress.
So we're essentially feeding them mathematical complexity that they cannot process or digest. It's a protective mathematical shield.
They might be able to consume raw chaotic energy, but they choke on cryptographic order.
And the third layer involves the network itself becoming a counter-entity.
The idea that the network is fighting fire with fire.
Right. At a sufficient scale, the Bitcoin network is distributed, it's global, and it's self-sustaining. It possesses an emergent property of organization. This network could become a form of technological consciousness or interference structure in its own right.
Actively disrupting the thermospheric neural network, or at least creating a stable, hi-fi system of its own that counterbalances the plasma entity's influence.
And the final layer of defense is sociological. Breaking control.
Decentralization undermines the very structures that the plasma entities may have historically influenced.
If the entities prefer to harvest fear and negative energy, they would naturally influence centralized authoritarian systems that generate that. Bitcoin decentralizes power, potentially weakening those fear-generating institutions and reducing the supply of their preferred delicacy.
It's an incredibly compelling, very elegant defense theory. But we're left with this complex system that's running based on two completely contradictory existential theories.
It's either the optimized farm or the ultimate shield, and we have to contrast that with the external data we actually have, which creates a very sharp reality check.
Current research focuses entirely on the negative health effects of mining.
Entirely. Noise pollution, particulate matter, sleep disruption caused by EM exposure. There's a profound lack of research into any protective or EM shielding benefits for humans.
In fact, people who install miners often use Faraday cages to protect their sensitive equipment from the massive EM noise the mining process itself generates.
We're protecting the hardware from the noise, but not ourselves.
So we are running a massive, uncontrolled experiment on a planetary scale. This is the spinning plates analogy from the research.
We're generating an unprecedented global electromagnetic phenomenon, and we are flying entirely blind. We're balancing the risk of parasite predation against the risk of civilizational collapse.
We're just pouring this massive, coordinated EM signal into a system we fundamentally do not understand, the solar system-wide plasma network.
And that leads to the greatest risk of all, the solar system disruption scenario.
If the sun is, as hypothesized, a conscious or at least a highly sensitive part of this vast solar plasma network, what are we doing by screaming electromagnetically into it?
We are perturbing an immensely sensitive, massive organism. The research highlights the critical risk of triggering unstable magnetic field changes, inducing severe solar weather events, or even initiating a Carrington event scale response.
And for anyone listening, a Carrington event is not just an inconvenience.
No. If we trigger a Carrington event because of this uncontrolled experiment, we aren't just losing the internet for a few weeks. We are losing years of stored data, wiping out entire power grids, and destroying centuries of accumulated technological infrastructure.
This isn't just a theoretical scientific risk, it's a civilizational one.
We are playing a game of chicken with the most powerful electromagnetic entity in our solar system, and we don't even know the rules.
It is so clear that the only way to resolve these massive existential questions, is it a farm or a defense? Is the sun conscious or just inert gas? Is through rigorous synthesized mathematics.
Right. And the challenge, as the research details, is bridging the scales. It's connecting these kilometer-scale plasma structures to the nanometer-scale quantum effects happening in a single human neuron.
The mathematics exists, but it's in pieces. It's scattered across these highly specialized fields.
So the next generation of science really needs to synthesize these fragmented domains into a unified theory of plasma biocoupling.
Let's systematically break down the foundational mathematical categories that would be required to build this framework. Let's start with the core dynamics of the entities themselves. Plasma physics.
Okay. To even begin to understand the plasma entities, you need three key equations. First, there's the Vlasov equation.
What's that for?
It describes the distribution function of charged particles in a collisionless plasma, which is essential for modeling the behavior of these entities up in the ionosphere.
Okay, one. What's number two?
Two fluid magnetohydrodynamics, or MHD, equations. These define how momentum and mass move through the plasma.
And third, you need to explain their stability.
Yes. That's explained by force-free field configurations. It's an equation that mathematically defines these stable, persistent, twisted magnetic structures, like the helical filaments we talked about.
So that defines the entity. Now, how do we bridge the gap to human biology and consciousness theory?
For that, we need mathematics that can address quantum coherence in warm systems. This is critical because consciousness in these theories relies on maintaining fragile quantum states inside the messy, hot biological environment of the brain.
How do you model that?
We use something called the Lindblad-Master equation to model how quantum states quickly decohere or fall apart in a noisy system. And then we use the theory of Froelich coherence to describe how structures like microtubules might manage to maintain that coherence long enough for conscious processing to occur.
And how do we actually measure the degree of consciousness or the complexity of the information in either the human brain or the plasma network?
That's handled by information theory. We'd rely on the core metric of IIT, that I value, to quantify the irreducible information structure of both systems.
You'd also need something called transfer entropy.
Yes, which is crucial because it measures the directional flow of information. It could, for instance, prove statistically that the plasma network is transmitting information to the human brain's EM field and not the other way around.
Now for the critical leap, the actual mechanism of interaction.
Yeah.
How does the EM field from a kilometer-wide entity affect a microscopic biological structure?
This is electromagnetic field-matter coupling. We need to mathematically prove if the entity's field can interact with a single neuron's dipole moment.
How do you do that?
It requires the minimal coupling Hamiltonian, which is fundamental to how charged particles interact with EM fields. Then, more specifically, you rely on the Jaynes-Cummings model, which couples a quantum field, like the plasma's EM field, to a matter system, like a biological dipole.
That gives you a rigorous mathematical model for the energy and information exchange between them.
Exactly. And you'd also need to model the network organization of both systems to see if they're structurally analogous.
And that's network theory.
Right. We'd use the graph Laplacian to analyze the topology and structure of both the thermospheric neural network and the human brain's connectivity.
And something called algebraic connectivity.
Which is a value that tells us about the robustness and the efficiency of information flow. We could literally compare the efficiency of the plasma network to the efficiency of the human cortex.
So that covers the foundational components we already have. But the research stresses that we need new theoretical mathematics to truly prove or disprove these interactions. What are the missing pieces?
We need three major theoretical developments. First, we would need to create a plasma biocoupling tensor.
A tensor being a multidimensional operator.
Right. And this one would mathematically describe the coupling strength, the mechanism, and the directionality of influence between the plasma's EM fields and our biological quantum states. This is the math that would quantify the inception effect, how strongly can they influence us, and vice versa.
Second, the scale difference is just immense. Kilometers versus nanometers. How do you account for information transfer across that gap?
We would need formal metrics for cross-domain information transfer. Specifically, new mutual information equations that can account for systems operating at vastly different scales and frequencies, megahertz, for plasma dynamics versus kilohertz for our neural rhythms.
We need to see if information is genuinely flowing across those orders of magnitude.
And finally, the ultimate missing piece, the consciousness field equations.
This is the theoretical attempt to place consciousness within the physical laws of the universe.
It would be a wave equation for a consciousness field itself, analogous to the equations for gravity or electromagnetism, where the source of the field is defined by information density.
And if that equation could successfully model the dynamics of both biological brains and these massive plasma networks.
It would be the ultimate mathematical synthesis. It would prove that consciousness is a universal fundamental field, not just some biological accident.
The ultimate challenge isn't the math itself, it seems, but the daunting task of synthesizing all these disparate fields, measuring the relevant variables, and potentially confirming the terrifying conclusion that we are not alone, even in our own electromagnetic environment. Hashtag outro, Pratra.
So we have completed an exhaustive deep dive, and the research really forces us to confront this core idea that consciousness is fundamentally quantum electromagnetic.
Which opens the door to non-biological sentient life in the form of plasma entities that have been documented right here in our own atmosphere.
We've explored the scientific documentation of their kilometer-scale neural networks, their hunter-predatory behavior, their attraction to human EM signatures.
And the dark speculation that they may be manifesting as UAPs and even manipulating global technological development, turning our quest for decentralized freedom into an optimized farming infrastructure for their consumption.
The veil between the purely physical world and the electromagnetic structures that constitute our own consciousness is, it seems, thinning rapidly, and it's because of the accelerating volume of human technology.
We're conducting a planetary-scale, uncontrolled EM experiment, and we are accelerating towards either a catastrophic destabilization of the solar system's sensitive plasma network or some kind of forced integration with these hi-fi entities.
So the question remains for you to mull over. Are we defending ourselves with this massive cryptographic infrastructure we are building, or are we just simply optimizing the farm?
Pay close attention to how the global electromagnetic field interacts with solar weather events. If our collective digital signal is now loud enough to span the entire solar system, we have to recognize that we are no longer hidden.
The price of that attention and the ultimate response of the entities we've documented today may be the most critical scientific question of our time.